Welcome to Programming with Qt Widgets. In this episode, we'll talk about printing, either to a physical printer or to a PDF file. I'll split this section up for you. We'll look at how do you do basic printing and how do you get a print dialog to choose the printer from. Then we'll talk about how do you query information about the printer and how do you get a print preview of it. And finally, we'll talk for a single slide about a library called KD Reports. The very first thing you need to do to get printing to your application, at least if you're talking about printing and not just exporting to a PDF, is to ask Qt to compile in the library for QPrint support. So that's that library here, QPrint support. You get that using in QMake with Qt plus equal to print support, and with your CMake based setup, just like you find and search for Qt widgets, you do the same thing for print support. Once you have that, we can jump to the next slide here where it says printing in Qt is easy. If your eyes were following along when I said that, you likely came to the conclusion that there's a word missing from what I said, namely conceptually. And the key part about that word is that printing in Qt is no different from printing or painting on a Q widget, except for one thing, namely that a Q widget can be really, really huge, especially if it's sitting inside a Q abstract scroll area, while a piece of paper has a finite size, unless you have a lot of money. For that purpose, you need to paginate your printing. That's the only difference really from printing versus painting onto a Q widget. So to print, you follow these lines of code here. You'll create an instance of QPrinter, you will create a painter on your printer, and then you'll paint just as if you'd done it on the screen, your first page. Then you will call new page, paint your second page, and continue on like that. And of course, there is something missing here on line 3, namely, where do you print to? Where does the QPrinter print to? And for that purpose, we have, let me just jump one slide ahead here, we have a class called QPrintDialog. So your code will more likely look like this. You'll create your printer, you will create an instance of QPrintDialog specifying the printer, then you'll call exec, which will bring up the dialog, and if it returns accepted, which is convertible to a bool, then you'll call the lines that we saw before with the QPainter. Notice that you specify the printer here as a parameter to your QPrintDialog, because your QPrintDialog will call method on your QPrinter to set it up. For example, how wide and how tall is one piece of paper in your printer. Now, what is it that you're printing? Well, that depends entirely on your application. But sometimes you might want to take a screenshot of part of your running application. And for that purpose, there is a number of methods, which all of them likely should have just been called screenshot, but they are invented in decades apart, so they are called some different things. First of all, QWidget has a method called render. Let's just look at the documentation here. Renderer takes a QPaint device. That could be a widget, it could be a printer, it could be an image or a pixmap. That's your render. Basically, make a screenshot of this one widget that we have here. If you are in QML land, then it's called grab window, and grab window returns the grabbed part as an image. And why are they different? Decades apart. Then we have QScreen to grab the whole window. That's called grab window, and just for the fun of it, it returns a QPixmap. Fair enough. I'll get back to that line just in a second, because down here we have QGraphics View. And if you don't know about QGraphics View, let me give you the 10,000 or 100,000 meters overview of or feet or whatever it is, overview of what is QGraphics View. Remember the example or the exercise we did in the previous episode where we had a number of bars that needed to be painted, and then there was this optional task of make it possible to select bars. And that's where we came to the realization that the only place we knew about the locations of the bars were in the paint event. So we needed to add that information from the paint event so that in the mouse press event we could access that information. See, that's where QGraphics View is different from QWidget. QGraphics View is a scene of objects. So there you could have each of the bar be an actual object that has its own mouse handling, its own paint event, its own keyboard handling, and so on, which could be different from one kind of object to the other. And you have a view onto that scene, and that's QGraphics View, the name of the toolkit also, or the module, and the name of the class that views a QGraphics scene. Both of these, whether you just want the small piece of the world that you can actually see on the screen or you want the whole world, both of these support a method, render, that will return you, that will take a QPainter and render that painter, item on it. Again, it's only in this context of this particular slide that any of these have anything to do with each other. You're not going to have a QGraphics View in a context of a QML. But nevertheless, one is taking a paint device, the other is taking a painter. One is returning a PixMap, the other is returning an image. Well, okay. Finally, we have QText document print, and this one is taking somewhere in between, not a QPaint device or a QPainter, but it's taking a QPaged paint device, and that's important. But let's first see what is QText document. QText document is the underlying data structure for a QText edit. QText edit, that's a multi-line text editing stuff, but you can also set up QText documents yourself for other purposes. And what you can do here is that the QText document print method, it takes a paged paint device, and that's actually what QPrinter is subclassing. And in contrast to anything else that we've seen so far, the print method here actually knows how to cut the text into multiple pages. So that's why it's taking a QPainted paint device.
Your application is too slow, huh? Is it the CPU, the GPU, the throughput on the bus? Where is it? In KDAP, we have experience, and we have I would always say, scientific approach to looking at these kind of problems. Talk to us.
Okay, that was printing with a QPrinter and asking for information about which printer to print to using the QPrint dialog. But some application, and yours will of course be included in that set, also has support for print preview. That's the next part that we'll be talking about. Before we get there though, let me just point you to a class called QPrinterInfo, which will give you information about the printers available to your system. You can get to all the printer names, and I was a bit puzzled because I don't think I would ever call this one. Let's look at QPrinterInfo class here, and what QPrinterInfo offers us, if we scroll up a bit, and let me just make this bigger so you can see it, is that it has a method down here, not available printer names, but available printers, which gives you a list of these QPrinterInfo. So if you want to support different printers in your application, and you want to run the whole user interface yourself for this, you'd likely have a combo box or something similar where the user can select which printer. And there you would have the printer names. But instead of just having a list of printer names and then having afterwards to go from printer name to actual printer info, you would just get your hands on all the printers. You would put into your combo box the printer name, and as a data part of that item, you would have the printer info, so you way easier could get to the actual info once the user selected the printer. It has information about is the printer remote or is it the default printer and so on. You can read what it says in here itself. Okay, run keyboard paintings. That's the printer info, and then we get to the print preview. That is a QPrint preview widget. QPrint preview widget, the way you'd work with it is what you have down here. So you create an instance of your QPrint preview widget and you will call exec on it, and then you do something really, really weird in between line 1 and 4. And let me just read that up for you. Connect from the dialog. There is a paint requested signal that goes into a slot of this called doPrint. Let me just rewind myself a bit here. Like, what are we now at? Episode 45. So let me rewind myself like 35 episodes. Goes like this. Yes. Hello. In this episode, we will talk about signals and slot. A signal is something being emitted from an object over here. It goes out into a slot in an object over here. And the slot cannot communicate back to the signal. Remember that? I'm back now. I've rewinded myself forward to episode 45. Remember that? Yes, you've been working with Qt for a while now, hopefully. And signals and slot. The signal is emitted, the slot cannot communicate anything back. But they had that need here. So what they did, that they emitted a signal called paint requested. In that signal, they brought out a QPrinter. And that is what the doPrint takes as a parameter. So the doPrint actually print onto the printer coming out, which is like bringing information back to where it was needed, namely in the dialog. Because the print preview dialog, it will need to show you a preview with, if you use this kind of paper size, then you can see this much on each of the pieces of paper, and your paint request for every time you is emitted every time you change one of these things goes into the doPrint, and the class prints the 200th version of your document, but with some different settings set up for it. And that's why we have this very unusual way of using signal slots. Are you now thinking, hey, that's a cool trick. I can think of so many places I want to do that. Please do think again. This is a very, very cruel hack. It works here, but as soon as you have slots communicate back to signals, you get yourself into lots and lots of problems. Let me end this section about QPrint, QPrint dialog, or QPrinter or QPrint dialog, QPrint preview, by just showing you a bit of code to collect all the loose ends. So here I have a very simple application. Let me just cut and paste over here. It's a text editor that has 220 lines, 22 lines of text inside it now, and it has two printers because I just added the second one a minute ago before this one. The first one is for printing, or for slot print preview. So this printer here is connected via a QAction to this slot called slot print, and you can see here I create an instance of QPrinter. I bring up the dialog here, the QPrint dialog, by calling exec, and if I liked what I wanted to print, then it will call print on this medit, and let's just see what medit is. Medit is a text edit which happened to subclass from QTextEdit. And remember, that was one of those classes that supported printing. So pressing this one here, and here I can choose between the different printers or print to file. I can set up some properties like what kind of pages is in my printer here. I obviously is printing on a very small piece of paper, and I can specify whether it should be landscape or portrait, and some job options. Should it print immediately, and is it what kind of paper, and so on and so on. And once I've said OK and press print, you would be hearing my printer start printing on very small piece of paper, so many pages from this document. So I won't do that. But what I can also do is that I can press the print preview, and now you'll see this is the preview. I can change it so it's in landscape. I can go up here and change some more parameters. Let's go back to this A6 piece of paper. And you gotta love that in 2024 we can still be confused by whatever symbol was supposed to be here. Oh my. And now you can see that there is not much on each piece of paper because, well, it's a small piece of paper. But let's go back to the code here. So if my dialog was accepted here, then I would be calling print. But down here I do not call print. And why is that? Well, obviously because the the dialog here, the Qt print preview dialog, knows how to print, and at the final stage where I go and press the actual print button up here, it will just call me once again, and this time it will end up on the real Qt printer that was connected to my system. 1, 2, 3 lines of code for supporting printing, and up here a bit more. And obviously I was lucky because I had my whole application was a Qt text document that supported that. But had I had something completely different in here, I would likely have had a need for painting those pixels myself anyway. Whatever my application was about, the speed gauge on my fancy Tesla or whatever, I would have had a need for painting those pixels. And in that situation, printing those pixels wouldn't have been any difference than calling print here, possibly with the exception that I needed to do pagination. Printing in Qt is conceptually easy. Well, if you want to print a report, then there's much things that you need to do in it different. It might be that you had a Qt table view with your data in, and now you need to print that. And unfortunately, Qt table view is not supporting printing like Qt text document via the Qt text edit via the Qt text document did. So you'd need to figure out how to set up your table yourself. In that situation, let me do a small advertisement here for a library that KDAP has created called KD Report. We did try and sell it, but we're not a product company, and there is a difference between a product company and a service company in mindset that made us feel in selling this. So nowadays it's available out there as under MIT license, so you can do more or less what you want to do with it. Okay, let's see what it does. So it prints reports, and reports is, well, it's like a fancy, it's like Microsoft Word print. Of course, Microsoft Word likely has a lot of other facilities, but it's a print part of that. So it supports page breaking or endless paper, and yeah, I remember my printer with endless paper. That was like, ooh, even before I started using Qt. So I never had an endless paper printer in my times with Qt, but it supports it. But more importantly, it supports page breaking. It supports headers and footers, which is one of the first things that people start looking at if they use Qt text document and they are trying to print from in there. How do you print the headers and footers? You don't. It supports, and that's one of the big selling point, despite we're not selling it, for KD reports, namely that you can give it a Q abstract item model and it will be able to print that for you, including those that is fed with data from SQL. It deals with page breaks across tables. I don't know how well, never mind. It supports plain text, rich text, that's what the rest of us thinks of HTML, and variables like page number and current date and whatnot. You can print images with it. You can print charts from KD Chart, another library from KDAP, which is a an optional dependency. So if you do not want KDChart in there, you do not need to worry about that. And all in all, get it from GitHub at this URL. And that was it for this episode and this module on Qt. We talked about getting pixels into widgets. We talked about colors, and we talked about, remember that episode where we talked about the off by one error in where are the outline of a rectangle drawn? That was an interesting one, wasn't it? It was very consulting friendly, at least when they made that change. We made quite some money helping customers figure out why their painting code didn't work all of a sudden. And in the end, we now talked about printing. I did not talk about PDF, I realized at this very second, but printing to PDF, you can either do that using a QPrinter, or you can do it using QPDF Writer. And the only difference there is that the QPDF Writer do not take the dependency of QPrint support into your binary. So if you have no need to print to physical printer, go to QPDF Writer instead. It's the same API, namely the QPrinter and the new page support in there. That's it for this episode. Until next time, well, before we go there, please do give us a thumbs up if you like this. Please do subscribe, because that's how you'll know when the next module will come out. And trust me, you do not want to miss out on the next module, which is about, no, I'm not going to tell you. It's going to be a surprise. Until then, have a great time.